Welcome to the program. My name is Alexander Kerry. Ukraine's war on corruption is ongoing. General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko has recently announced that more than $2 billion worth of funds have been recovered by state prosecutors during the investigation of cases relating to former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. But what about corruption on Ukraine's front line? The Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee, alongside with Transparency International, have teamed up and released a report outlining how corruption is undermining the international community's efforts to help the Ukrainian army. Joining us in the studio to discuss Ukraine's effort to tackle endemic corruption is a member of the Anti-Corruption Committee and British Lieutenant General Timothy Evans. Thank you for joining us in the studio.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
First, let's define a few terms here. This report points out two types of corruption: the widespread petty corruption and the systemic corruption. Can you explain those terms?
Widespread petty corruption is often on items like fuel or uniform, small items that actually can be mismanaged or actually taken and stolen. Systemic is where it actually is all ongoing and it's throughout the system. And what we are trying to understand here is it the actual corruption that's affecting at the front line, or is that what used to happen? Because we've seen improvements since 2014. So if it isn't systemic and it's not petty corruption, what is it then that might be preventing you having the most effective force at the front?
So which one is the hardest to fight, the petty corruption or the systemic corruption, or are these intertwined phenomenon?
I think they're intertwined, but actually it's systemic. Because if it's in a culture, or if it's had spread throughout the system, or what area or what type do you try and tackle first? And the main area, I think, is to try and understand what are the risks. If you can understand the vulnerabilities and the risks of corruption, you can then think about how you mitigate against them. And once you do that, you can then start understanding the system. Once you understand the system, you can then put forward practical solutions. And that's what NARCO tries to do. It isn't just examining a thing for a process. It's trying to understand how do you get the real solutions and recommendations that are going to help your army.
So you talked about the risk. What are the risks exactly? What risk are we talking about here?
The risk here is often the temptation. Because if there's a process available that people think that they can get away by selling, moving on, taking goods, or actually if people are going to be bought and actually equipment isn't going where it should do, therefore it can go up. And at what level is that happening? Is that at the very basic level, or is it systemic? Is it throughout the system? And that's how I think what we were trying to establish is how do you make sure that the security assistance in Ukraine is the best for our soldiers? And we found that actually it wasn't systemic necessarily. There are other things that we needed to look at.
So would you say that winning the war against corruption is the first step to win the war in eastern Ukraine? It is a big obstacle to the path to victory?
It is if it's systemic. But as you understand, the war is very complex and there's many facets of how you're going to win the war. But what's important is you know that actually corruption is going to hinder your advance and going to hinder getting success. And that's why it's important for every soldier, whichever campaign, to make sure that corruption isn't in your system and in your society.
So, coming to the systemic corruption here and the big defense group as Ukroboron problem, would you say that Ukrainian army is the collateral victim of this lack of transparency in this defense industry system?
What we would think here is that if you haven't got transparency, you don't truly know what is perhaps available for your soldiers. And is it the best equipment? Is it the equipment they need for the front? Or is it the equipment just that you can produce? And therefore we would say that by having a more transparent system, you can understand what the needs are of the soldiers at the front line and then make sure your defence industries are going to produce that equipment that your soldiers require. If you don't have that transparency, we don't know what is being produced. Is it the best? Is it right for the environment? Is it now with up-to-date technology? All these things that we would expect our soldiers to have and your soldiers deserve, you've got to understand the system.
So it's a matter of information more than anything else?
Well, in one part, it's understanding who has the control. And is it that the Ministry of Defence decides the policy and then works out what the threat is and then passes down its direction to your state industries? Or is it that the state industries directs up to your Ministry of Defence what it can have? We would advocate that the Ministry of Defence determines what it needs and then make sure that the orders are passed down to your state industry to then deliver what you need to actually prosecute your campaign.
But what if the state industry is actually a state industry, so owned by the state? Isn't there a paradox here?
There is, and I think therefore if you own it, therefore you've got all the will to say this is what we require, this is what we need for our country, and this is what, in a sense, you need to do to prosecute the success in this campaign. So it should be able to be done, but I think you just need this transparency to understand truly what is going on inside Uber-Pom and other state industries.
So how can international donors ensure that devices and funds are properly distributed in the field?
There are a number of ways that you can do this. I think firstly, the donors have got to understand who is providing what to make sure there's not duplication from one nation and another. Also, as we said about the transparency, to understand what Uber-Pom is delivering, to make sure, again, we're not delivering the same items, and then making sure that you are good tracking system of your equipment. So have you got the inventory? Have you now got the latest software which will help you distribute, record, and know where that equipment is going? Because what you want to make sure is that the right equipment is going to the right place at the right time, and it's in the nature of which is going to suit the soldiers who are then going to have to use it.
So it's mostly about logistics?
In part logistics, but also with equipment, you've got to think about training. So even though you've got the equipment, are your soldiers trained? And we discovered there are occasions where the training was perhaps given to soldiers, but that equipment then wasn't given to those particular soldiers or unit. It was passed to another unit. They hadn't had the training. So if you get this oversight, if you have the transparency to understand where your equipment is going, who's been trained, are you then ready to receive it? Do you know where that equipment, and then you can account for it? Then in a sense it just helps and makes sure that the security assistance is being provided as you require it.
And so my final question was, in the report points out that military officials prompted the Canadian government, for example, to involve Ukraine's volunteer organization. Why would you say volunteer organizations are more reliable than the classic circuits today?
From that particular example, it was believed that the equipment wasn't getting to where it should be required. But we knew that there was or I've been told, that there was a volunteer organisation that had an efficient and effective setup, that the Canadians would then know that that equipment is going to the soldiers where it should be. And therefore the important part here, I think, is for the Ministry of Defence to look and see what the volunteers are doing, because they've done some tremendous work through these last few years. But you can't be complacent. You can't just accept that the volunteers are doing that well. You've now got to think, right, how does my professional army now cover what the volunteers are doing now? So what is it on logistics? What is it on the tracking? What is it on the training? What is it on all the aspects that the volunteers are providing? Now, the Ministry of Defence must make sure they've got the training programme, the equipment, the funding to do what the volunteers are doing. And that way you'll build your professional army to be ready for the future and for all the threats, now, next 5 years and 10 years. And that's really important, because you just don't know where your threats or when your threats might come home.
Thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
In the studio. That was Lieutenant General Timothy Evans talking about war and corruption in Ukraine. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.